And the objectives for this session today are really to understand what telecommunications and digital rights are and their importance to the Palestinian struggle, understanding how telecommunication blackouts are unlawful methods of warfare, and centering the importance of telecommunications to rebuild and reconnect Gaza and amplify 7amleh's campaigns and calls to actions. And to start the presentation, we want to first define what telecommunications are. So telecommunications, or telecom, is the exchange of information over large distances between devices like telephones and computers through wireless or wired means. And there are two types of main telecoms. There's businesses, mobile and internet telecom companies. And this is part, of course, of everyday life. Phones, radios, and television broadcasting, the internet, etc., things that we often daily use. And many of us take easy access to mobile and internet telecommunications for granted, but there are many people who don't have access to these services. And this is a deeply political issue, as a lack of access to telecommunications in our modern world limits the ability of some to engage with an increasingly digital society. So, for example, if someone is unable to afford internet or mobile, they're limited in their ability to apply for jobs or housing, to send or receive money, contact emergency services, etc. This essentially contributes to keeping people trapped in a cycle of poverty. And because staying connected and having digital access is so central to accessing other basic needs, like housing and emergency services, international law emphasizes digital rights as a basic human right that must be protected. On this slide, we have briefly outlined what digital rights are and where they are referenced in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But basically, digital rights are the right to access the internet and the right to digital privacy, which fall under the rights to freedom of expression, which fall under the rights to access and accessing information, as we have clearly shown, are being violated here. And in our increasingly digital world, digital rights are connected to other human rights, such as the right to access housing or emergency services, as we've mentioned. And this is really important to know because it means that everything we will discuss today about how Israel is focusing or controlling Palestinian telecommunications actually all constitute violations of Palestinian digital rights and therefore violations of international law. Now, before we dive into telecommunications in Palestine, we first want to offer the framework of de-development as a foundation for our understanding. As we have said, in our increasingly digital society, telecoms have become increasingly central to everyday life. And de-development is defined by Sarah Roy as a process which undermines or weakens the ability of an economy to grow and expand by preventing it from accessing and utilizing critical inputs needed to promote internal growth. So to put it in simpler terms, de-development refers to a systematic and intentional inhibition of an economy's ability to grow through placing structural barriers such as sanctions or making them in debt through institutions like the World Bank or the IMF. The idea of what is developed or underdeveloped definitely shouldn't be taken for granted, as colonial narratives state that the society of the colonizer is more advanced and than that of the colonized, who are backwards or not developed. But what we are discussing is a political and material reality where colonial nations exploit other nations and rake in profits to further the economic development while employing a series of intentional policies to limit the economic development of others. And so, de-development refers to the intentional weakening of countries in the global South. The term de-developed, is different to the mainstream economic terms of underdeveloped or developing countries, which make it seem that some countries are being behind in terms of development is a natural occurrence. Instead, what de-development offers is that it complicates the idea of development by emphasizing that what is understood as underdevelopment is actually a systemic and intentional process. A great resource on this, for example, is Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which points in its title to how Africa is not underdeveloped naturally, but has been subjected to European colonial policies, which were intended to limit its development. In the Palestinian context, we can likewise see that Israel employs a series of intentional policies with the aim of under or de-developing Palestinian society in an attempt to obstruct any form of Palestinian sovereignty. And we'll go into this more in detail on the next slide. We're going to be taking a very quick look at the Oslo Accords as a case study of how Israel de-develops Palestinian society. And to summarize the Accords, for those who may not be familiar, they were a series of secret peace negotiations between the Palestinian leadership and the Israeli representatives in 1993 that eroded Palestinian sovereignty even further, namely through implementing policies which contributed towards weakening and de-development of Palestinians on the ground. The Accords were unpopular and were widely rejected by many in Palestinian society. And we're now going to highlight how the Oslo Accords entrenched de-development in Palestine. First, they brought about the aid for peace model, which means that in return for international aid, there will be peace and coexistence between Israel and what was set out to be a Palestinian state under the two-state solution. However, aid in this context is simply a neo-colonial tool where aid is highly conditional and does not contribute to anything that can bring about Palestinian freedom or sovereignty. In fact, it has made the West Bank and Gaza simply more dependent on international aid because of the erosion of local capacities for development. Yet, despite this dependency and the influx of international aid to these territories, the conditions Palestinians are living in are worse than ever today than they were before, with high levels of poverty and food insecurity and unemployment and income gaps. Palestinian manufacturing and production, lastly, and agricultural capacities have also been severely eroded. To give an example of one of the telecom-specific policies which came out of the 1995 Oslo agreements and contributed to de-development of Palestinian society was actually the use of the radio spectrum, which are necessarily part of telecoms, in which the West Bank and Gaza requires pre-approval by Israel. And this quote by Al-Shabaka points and encapsulates this really well. Quote, "The aid model is itself a part of the occupation because it is designed in a way that subverts Palestinian development while reinforcing and subsidizing the Israeli occupation." So now what we want to discuss further is how Israel's de-development policies have systematically and intentionally targeted the telecommunications sector of Palestinian society. And as we said, telecom is central to everyday life, and so targeting is a part of Israel's policy towards de-development of Palestinian society. So some examples of this are the blockade of Gaza since 2006, which also restricts the movement of telecom equipment in and out of Palestinian land. As mentioned, the use of radio spectrum needed for mobile telecommunications in the West Bank and in Gaza is subject to pre-approval of Israel as enshrined in the Oslo Accords. Next, even to connect through Egypt and Jordan, Palestinians have to go through Israeli operators. And the Israeli government refuses to allocate 4G and 5G bandwidth to Palestinians in Gaza, making Gaza the only reported place in the world with mobile limited to 2G. What all of this means and what we can really understand from this is that Israel can deny Palestinians access to this basic right on a whim, because Israel is structurally in control of Palestinians' life in every single way possible, and the Palestinian economy, including the telecom sector. Now, Having discussed the wider context of colonial de-development, and specifically Israel's de-development of Palestinian society, we're going to discuss the genocide in Gaza and how Israel's military assaults target civilian infrastructure, including telecoms. The framework that can help us understand Israel's strategy towards the genocide, or excuse me, during the genocide, is the Dahya Doctrine. The Dahya Doctrine is an Israeli military strategy of causing large-scale destruction to civilian infrastructure in order to get them to surrender. The prime examples of this is what we saw repeatedly during the genocide, what we saw in the last 24 hours, and it was the targeting of hospitals, sanitation, food, water, roads, and also importantly, telecommunications. Here on the slide, we have an image showing aerial photos of Gaza before and after the genocide and showing the scale of destruction to civilian infrastructure. Ultimately, though, what is the reason for Israel's de-development of Palestine and its destruction of Palestinian infrastructure? It's important to understand that these tactics that Israel is using to achieve its goals as a settler colonial state, these goals are the elimination or displacement of Palestinians from their land, so that way Israel can seize and colonize these lands. This is what we've also seen during the genocide and after the ceasefire with Israel and the Trump administration attempting to relocate Palestinians from Gaza to Egypt and Jordan. And Trump has regularly cited the unlivable conditions in Gaza as his supposed rationale for wanting to displace them elsewhere. Destruction of civilian infrastructure has the effect of making life in Gaza unlivable. So in other words, for Palestinians who are not killed in the immediate violence of the military assault because of the destruction of the essential services such as sanitation, hospitals, housing, and so on, and if they remain in Gaza, will most likely die slowly of sickness, untreated wounds, starvation, cold, etc. And we'll discuss what this means in a moment and telecom in a moment. And I'll hand it over to Jalal to pick it up from here.
Thank you, Sarona. The destruction of telecom, of course, is part of Israel's de-development. It destroys Palestinian infrastructure, and therefore it is part and parcel of destroying Palestinian society. The targeting of telecoms is very intentional and aims to achieve specific goals as it affects Palestinians' ability to contact emergency services and also be informed about the ongoing onslaught, how to reach safety and where is safety. There are also psychological effects because Palestinians are restricted and limited from being able to communicate with their loved ones. They're restricted from being able to access recreational internet or telecommunications. And finally, this tactic is also about impacting Palestinians' ability to communicate their stories so the international community can accurately understand and often control the narrative. If Palestinians are unable to use the phone or internet to communicate what is happening to them directly, this enables Western media to reproduce and maintain narratives that distort the reality of what is actually happening on the ground. We're going to illustrate this further, how Israel's systematic destruction of Palestinian telecom infrastructure has been, particularly during the genocide on Gaza, and group it under some themes that can help us understand the factors that contribute to the destruction of telecommunications. This will also help us understand the various areas that need to be considered for reconstruction. The first area is the Israeli domination of this sector. As we've mentioned in the lectures earlier, when we're talking about development, Israel is in control of the telecom sector in Gaza, and Israel can bring down telecoms whenever they want. Internet operations in Gaza and the West Bank are even fed through Egypt. Even the ones fed through Egypt and Jordan are controlled by Israel. This is something Israel repeatedly weaponized during the genocide to bring down the internet connections at various moments in time. Of course, another area is military assaults. Telecommunications require physical infrastructure, such as mobile towers and fiber optic cables. Military assaults on Gaza have physically destroyed a huge amount of this infrastructure, especially the underground infrastructure of fiber optic cables, through which high-speed internet is provided in Gaza. Due to the danger, telecom service providers in Gaza were unable to access and assess which parts of the network were damaged. They weren't able to perform any physical assessment on the ground. Initial assessments through our reporting and our research indicated around 75% of telecom infrastructure were affected. At least 50% was fully destroyed. It's estimated that no more than 30% of mobile towers and other infrastructure are still active today. And if they are concentrated in very specific small areas that were not exposed to military attacks. Another area is displacement and congestion. Another important factor that contributes to the communication services being interrupted is the frequent evacuation of people from different places due to the ongoing assaults. These evacuations increase the congestion of populations in small areas. This made connectivity more difficult, as there would be more congestion on the available mobile networks covering the shelters, and there would be no capacity for the local area. Of course, one of the most important areas to discuss is electricity blackouts and how this led to this blackout, and of course, it's linked to the blockade on Gaza. During the genocide, mobile and internet providers ran out of fuel, causing various levels of telecom interruptions, reaching a full blackout at least 15 times. With the depletion of service providers' fuel storage and Israel's blocking of the entrance of fuel and other goods into Gaza, the UN allocated some fuel to the telecom operators from the quantity that was allowed to enter Gaza through Rafah crossing under UN supervision. Only, of course, for urgent humanitarian needs and unlimited, predetermined quantities. This helped two specific private telecom companies in Palestine, Paltel and Ooredoo, to resume their services by operating their diesel generators and electrifying some of their priority sites that remained active. After this, the telecom services passed through different periods of blackouts and restoration over time, depending on the daily fuel supply from the UN. The fuel needs were, of course, replenished on a daily or short-term basis. There was a lot of uncertainty in the operations of telecoms, and hence the blackouts kept occurring from time to time. Additionally, there were no reliable sources of electricity to charge for people to charge their phones, to stay connected. People had to spend long hours walking long distances, waiting in queues to charge their mobile phones, relying mostly on batteries charged by solar panels or diesel generators. I believe we have a video, so I don't know.
Thank you. Yeah. And just to really illustrate this, we're going to be showing you just about 30 seconds of a clip from Basan. I'm sure you know who's a famous journalist in the Strip. And just to demonstrate, I think, the very material impacts of what these electricity blackouts force people to do in order to attempt to access telecoms.
So a group of tents, like tent holders, my new neighbors, agreed to have some electricity, a limited amount of electricity during the night. So during the night, we charge the power banks, the phones, any other stuff we need.
And I know that was a short clip, but really what we were just trying to illustrate was amongst all the other kinds of conditions that are being created to subject Palestinians to this kind of violence, the violence of the telecoms, of attempting to restrict people's access to telecommunications, is an additional layer that I think those of us who have easy access to it don't really think about. But when we're in an emergency circumstance, it is the first thing we often turn to. So it's Israel's systematic attempt at debilitating Palestinians' ability to access one another. And I'll hand it back over to Jalal to carry us forward.
Thank you, Sarona. The effort it takes to actually seek telecommunications, it tells you most that you need to know about the resilience and the will of people to stay connected and why it's necessary. But us having detailed how Israel is targeting Palestinian telecoms and why they're targeting the telecom sector, in the final few slides, we're going to shift the focus towards reconstruction and liberation and how this can be achieved in the short to long term. The first thing we want to unpack before outlining possible strategies for reconstruction is that in addition to Israeli colonial domination and destruction of the telecom sector, Telecom is also fully owned and operated by private companies. Therefore, this further limits the Palestinians' autonomy over their own telecommunications because these private companies are primarily profit-driven. The telecom sector is fully owned by the private sector. This means the rebuilding of the sector cannot be done without direct involvement of the international community through aid. This is necessary in the short term, but in the long term, it's worth noting that international aid is also viewed as another colonial tool in Palestine. The forced dependency on foreign aid is systematic and structural, because aid is usually conditional and does not actually lead to Palestinian sovereignty. It is not a long-term sustainable solution because it is more like a band-aid on a broken arm, rather than a solution that actually builds autonomy and agency for Palestinians so that they can rebuild on their own terms without conditions. Of course, part of the goal is Palestinian control over the telecom sector by ourselves, for themselves, by themselves, for themselves, by ourselves, outside of the domination of Israel, outside of the domination of private companies. Complete Palestinian autonomy and sovereignty from the river to the sea is necessary. This brings us to the question of digital rights and how these are ensured for everyone, not just because those who can afford it, but for everyone who have to experience colonial domination, like the system we're in. If we go to the next slide. Okay. To wrap up this webinar, we want to talk about, what the reconstruction of Palestine and particularly Gaza's telecom sector should look like or looks like. This is comprised of short-term solutions and long-term solutions. Through our campaign, our research, we're emphasizing those goals for a reason. I'll go through the short term. In the short term, there has to be an end of the military assaults by Israel in order for us to prevent further damage and to begin rebuilding. The financial and physical support and investment of the international community is needed, for example, with restoring basic mobile services and moving mobile networks closer to shelters, increasing fuel allocated to telecom providers and the UN, providing high-speed internet in shelters, hospitals, schools, and other humanitarian organizations, and facilitate efficient distribution of humanitarian resources through e-vouchers, codes, etc. Priority should be given to recovering basic mobile internet services in areas with dense populations, such as shelter places and humanitarian operations centers. In the long term, telecom infrastructure needs to be rebuilt and made more resilient. This includes things like the reconstruction of the destroyed fiber optics infrastructure. The rebuilding of mobile infrastructure, of course, should include, and we call for it to include 4G and 5G technologies, rather than just 2G, which was previously the limit of what was allowed. Information and communications technology, the ICT sector, should also be made more resilient against electricity cuts through storing electricity as backup. In addition to all this, there must be an investment in renewable energy as well, which can be done through the private sector working with humanitarian organizations. Of course, finally, there must be a political solutions that are oriented towards achieving Palestinian sovereignty and freedom. Otherwise, Palestinians will be caught in a cycle where Israel can continue to exercise its domination and its destruction of the telecom sector at any time. This means an end to the blockade on Gaza. Also, although aid from the international community is important in this juncture, long-term solutions and freedom necessitate that Palestinians are unable to be self-sufficient and not stuck in cycle of dependency.
Thanks, Jalal.
Of course, thank you, Sarana. I'll hand it back to you.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording part now, as we will be moving into the Q&A.